Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, Carolus Magnus, succeeded his father Pepin in 768 to become king of the Franks. A brutal expansionist, Charlemagne led or organized no less than more than 50 military campaigns over the course of his lifetime. Pretty much every year that he was king, he was campaigning. He campaigned here in Italy. In fact, he even got to southern Italy, where I am. He besieged this city, the city of Salerno. He ended up conquering northern Italy, the polity of the Lombards. He, at the invitation of anti-Umayyad forces in Spain, marched into Spain, successfully fighting against the Umayyads. Now, he was harassed on the way out, disastrously for him, by Christian Basques, but he was able to carve out a Spanish march in Spain. He defeated the Bavarians in southeastern Germany, which butted up his domains against those of the Slavs and the Avars. The Slavs he turned into tributary peoples for the most part. The Avars he obliterated. He wiped them off the map. I mean, they just disappear from history after Charlemagne. Then there's the Saxons, the pagan, ferocious Saxons. 18 of his campaigns targeted the Saxons, and ultimately he conquered them as well in an act of brutal, forced conversion. Either they converted to Christianity or they were massacred or expelled. By the time he was done, at the zenith of his power, Charlemagne's territory it represented an empire bigger than any other until Napoleon. You got to go all the way to the 1800s and Napoleon, if you don't count the Russian Empire, which is mostly Asia. You got to go all the way to Napoleon to get an empire as big as Charlemagne's was. The Franks had been close to the papacy for years, many years before Charlemagne came along. And the papacy had cultivated that relationship with the Franks, even as the Pope's links to, the Byzantines in the East weakened over time. So, when in 799 a coup against the Pope took place, against Pope Leo III, we're not exactly sure what the coup was about. It may have been his papal predecessor's family had issues with his non-noble heritage or whatever. He was accused of perjury and adultery and all these things. Anyway, they beat him up. They tried to cut out his tongue and scrape out his eyes or whatever. He escapes, and where does he go? He goes to Charlemagne's court, and Charlemagne provides him refuge, and Charlemagne agrees to help him. And so in 800, Charlemagne marches into Rome, with the Pope, of course, and helps clear his name of perjury and adultery, and he's reinstated. And on Christmas Day, in the year 800, after Christmas Mass, Charlemagne is supposedly surprised when the Pope crowns him Emperor of the Romans. And the Roman people are alleged to have shouted 3 times at this event, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and pacific Emperor of the Romans, life and victory." The Pope likely saw in Charlemagne a new imperial protector, a new Constantine, someone who could check the power of the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire and its increasingly rival clergy. Now, for Charlemagne's part, there's no question he already saw himself as an emperor, but a Frankish emperor, a Christian emperor, but a Frankish emperor. Whether or not he wanted to be emperor of the Romans too, and thus beholden to the Romans and to the Pope, well, that's a matter of debate. Charlemagne's biographer, Einhard, certainly portrays the events of that Christmas Mass and after as a legitimate surprise to Charlemagne, that the Pope's crowning of Charlemagne was unexpected. In fact, he goes so far as to say that Charlemagne never would have come to church that day had he known what the Pope was planning. Now, we don't know if that's true, and I think most modern scholars assume that the two had actually planned for all this, probably months in advance. But whatever the truth, Charlemagne was now the equal of the Byzantine emperor, and Rome, the Roman Empire, had an heir in the West. Now, Charlemagne needed educated clergy. He needed educated state officials. In fact, he himself seems to have been quite intellectually curious. And so he invited all great scholars from Western and Central Europe to come to his court at Aachen, where he built a palace and a school. The palace included a school. Charlemagne is credited with launching a rebirth of learning in the West. In fact, contemporary sources are continually referring to a rebirth, a renewal, a restoration. That is, a restoration of the glory of Christian Rome and the church fathers and of the learning of that time. So in that sense too, Charlemagne is an heir of Rome. Now, the Carolingian Renaissance involved imitating classical art, imitating classical architecture, but probably more than anything else, it was an attempt to revive learning. The great English poet and scholar Alcuin ended up leading the school for years and years. Alcuin, who was taught in the tradition, his teacher was a disciple of Bede, so he was educated in that tradition. Alcuin taught classical Latin. Also many Italian scholars from here invited up there to teach classical Latin as well. Alcuin instituted Cassiodorus' 7 liberal arts, so the trivium and the quadrivium. And this will become very important when it comes to the medieval educational tradition, because Alcuin's students are going to go on. So throughout the 800s, Alcuin's students are going to go on to found their own schools, and then their students will go on to found their own schools. And this became the standard in Europe throughout the medieval period, all the way up to the Renaissance and beyond in some places. So very, very important in terms of Western civilization's educational tradition. The emphasis was less on, so you go back to the classical period, we might say the emphasis when it came to education and learning was on how to think, seeking wisdom, whereas the Carolingian Renaissance seems to have been focused more, think textbooks, more on what to learn, more on gaining a store of knowledge. So sort of a different emphasis there, and some scholars I know consider the Carolingian Renaissance educationally actually to have been a step backwards, but very, very influential when it comes to the Western civilization's educational tradition. Charlemagne seems to have seen his kingdom as a new Israel, and to have seen himself like the anointed kings of the Old Testament. In other words, having a duty to cultivate righteousness among his people and to spread true doctrine. His favorite book, according to Einhard, was The City of God, Augustine's City of God. So he seems to have seen his own people, Franks and non-Franks, as long as they're in his domain, as equal and chosen like Israel and part of this city of God. And those outside of his domain, the pagans outside of his domain, as part of the city of the world. So in this sense, scholars have compared his thinking, this idea, to that of the Muslim Ummah. When Charlemagne returned to the Frankish heartland from Rome, he made his subjects swear allegiance to him by oath and identifying him as Caesar. For the first time, Western Europe had a recognized emperor since the fall of Rome. Charlemagne, the greatest of the Germanic kings, controlling most of Central and Western Europe, the greatest of the Germanic kings, had been crowned Roman emperor by a Christian pope. So we see in Charlemagne embodied 3 great roots: the Germanic root, the Christian root, and the Greco-Roman root. The 3 great pillars, arguably, of Western civilization. But the civilization represented by Charlemagne and his empire was indisputably different than that represented by the old Roman Empire. Just take a look at a map of the 2 empires, and maybe the geography alone proves this point. Some scholars, though, argue that with Charlemagne, we see the birth of Europe as a concept, European as a concept. Charlemagne is identified thus as the father of Europe. Other scholars refute this and say, no, there was no sense of European identity until maybe around the year 1000. Still, a Germanic king had been crowned Roman emperor by a Christian pope. Perhaps Rome had its heir in the West.